in CPD, in today's CPD, we have Chris Morgan, that is on screen, of John Gilbert Architects, and he will be discussing the current works that are being done to upgrade a traditional Glaswegian tenement building on Niddrie Road, that is the one in the picture, to meet the EnerPHit standard. This project is very interesting and was commissioned by the Southside Housing Association, and it aims to demonstrate an approach that tackles energy efficiency and fuel poverty, and it also tries to address all the issues that are related to health and well-being, as well as heritage, building maintenance and management. So our speaker today is Chris Morgan, and he's an architect and director at John Gilbert Architects, and he has over 30 years experience in ecological design and sustainable development. So I think that everyone is here, so it's time for me to shut up and let Chris speak. So enjoy the CPD. Bye.
Thanks, Sylvia. Can everybody hear me okay? Is this working okay? Just double checking. Yeah. Okay, so I'll crack on. There's 3 bits to this, but it's mainly about the case study, but I wanted to add a little about why we are so keen on EnerPHit. Somebody's not on mute. I thought it's the same area. It may have been nowhere near it. Just need to get someone off mute. So just why we're so keen on it. So I'll briefly go through why. This is what Scottish Government wants to do with energy efficiency generally. There's quite a comprehensive scheme strategy that's been put together. This is it in full graphically, and it boils down to net zero by 2045. Most tenures are EPC level C. Social housing is a B. That's what we're working on a lot. There's a focus on zero carbon heating and no more gas boilers. I suspect all of you know this sort of thing. It's pretty comprehensive scheme strategy, and it's pretty realistic with quite a few get-out clauses for things like historical buildings and so on. But we have a lot of concerns about the way that is headed. A number of them there, but the 2 that I wanted to mention briefly was just the pace of change and this business called the performance gap. So if you look at the graph on the left, you can see what we're supposed to be doing. It's a really dramatic and quick reduction in carbon emissions. That's what the scientists are telling us. And what's happening on the right is the graph you can see. That is Scottish Government information on how we are gradually improving the energy efficiency of our built stock. But I would invite you to compare the graphs and the angles and see what you think. But the point is, you know, we're nowhere near fast enough. We're nowhere near the sort of pace of change that we need to do. And so whilst there are issues with doing EnerPHit and all of these much greener or more carbon efficient buildings, in some ways I don't feel I should apologize, because we really have to push very hard. There's another issue which is called the performance gap, and I won't labor this point, but one of the problems with the systems that we use, and I'm sure most of you know about this, is that when you predict what's going to happen with energy in your building, it's just not accurate. And both those diagrams I won't go into, but they demonstrate that what we think is going to happen as architects and engineers and consultants in buildings, if we use the standard sort of methodologies, it just isn't true. And broadly speaking, you can say on average that the energy consumption is about 60% more. So we obviously, as architects who care about what we're doing, don't want to be saying to our clients, oh yeah, I'll be really energy efficient, and then it just isn't, you know. So we want to understand what we're doing and be in control of it. And this, for anybody who doubts the sort of, or who's concerned about the veracity of the EPC system, this is 400 houses in England, which were grouped by their EPC rating, and then they were actually measured in reality. And what you can see is that there isn't an awful lot of, what's the word, correspondence between what the EPC thinks they're doing and what people are being told that they're doing in their homes, and what's really happening. So obviously the B is slightly better, but the point is that Scottish Government is going to spend an enormous amount of money in the next few years getting all of the houses to be social housing anyway, certainly, and in some cases to C, And the problem I've got with that is that I don't think it will necessarily make an awful lot of difference, but we'll have spent a huge amount of money doing it. So my take on this is, if we're going to spend money, let's spend it on something that will actually work. And so I hope that makes sense. For that reason, we are interested in other ways of looking at how to manage this, how to understand it. This is something that is sort of fallen out of favor now, but I used to think it was very good sort of 10, 15 years ago. It's a thing called contraction and convergence. So the idea is that, that we all on the planet need to be using an equitable amount of carbon or energy or resources generally. But we all know that we use resources unequally. So how can we go about finding that sort of common path? So this was a path for doing it. But regardless of all the bits and pieces, that the point of it was that for Britain, what it means is that it's roughly 10% of what we are currently doing, or what we were currently doing. And I think there's too many numbers in sustainability. I don't really believe in too many numbers, but I do like to have an idea of rough scale. So roughly, if you aim for about 10% of what you were just about to do, then you're probably going to be actually sustainable. We don't need to be net zero. We don't need to have zero emissions. We just need to have much, much less. So 10% is roughly where we want to aim for, and which is roughly what Passive House is. So Passive House is roughly 10% of a normal building. And EnerPHit is roughly 10, 15% of a normal retrofit. So to me, it's about the right level, and we know that it works. So this graph demonstrates something that we've done in Scotland as well. This is a German example, but they measured what really happened in Passive House buildings, and it was more or less the black line and the red line that you can see horizontally there are more or less the same, because the Passive House methodology closes off all the little gaps that the EPC rating doesn't deal with, and therefore you know that you're getting quite close to the number. And to me, that means as architects and who are being paid by our clients, we can say to them, we're going to give you something which will do X, and it's true. So the client is basically getting what they pay for, broadly anyway, which feels like a professional and reasonable thing to want to do. I've worked for several years also monitoring Passive House buildings, low energy buildings, testing them. And what I would say sort of unequivocally is they do basically work. You can always abuse them. You can put your heating on full and open all the windows and then say, well, it's not working. But if you're a normal person, then they work pretty well. Sorry, I'm just managing slides at the moment. Where am I? So for us as a practice, EnerPHit is probably about right as an aspiration level. It's about 10% of normal if we can achieve that. And in addition, we know that we'll get what we said we were going to try and get, assuming that we meet all the criteria. There are issues of cost. I've got a slide later on about cost, because that's what everybody wants to talk about. It is costly, but well, so are lots of other things. The Letty, who you might have heard of in the ACB, have modelled, various organisations in England mainly have modelled what we need to do across the UK. So, and what I think it demonstrates is that the EnerPHit might be at the top end of what's necessary. So there might be a slightly easier option, and this diagram is worth showing you. It's a bit complicated, but if you imagine that all the houses in Britain, all the properties in Britain are the blue bits on that graph. I can't, for some reason my pointer isn't pointing, but if you look at those columns on the graph, which are all around 110, 120, 130, that's all of the buildings in Britain now based on their energy demand. And in Scotland, where it tends to be slightly worse because it's colder, basically. So you can say that roughly in Scotland, we're at the red circle. That's my superimposition on the graph. This is a Letty diagram for the record, if anyone is interested, L-E-T-I. The Scottish Government EISH programme will probably take most of those buildings to somewhere around the orange circle. That's not entirely fair in some cases. Some of them will be good, but if you factor in the performance gap, which EISH doesn't deal with, you don't get the number you think you're going to get. So it's going to be roughly around the orange, and that's just not enough. It's just not enough to get to where we need to be. So where we need to be is somewhere down where the orange bars are, but that's what Letty thinks we should be doing. And for what it's worth, the Passive House retrofit is the dark green on the left there, 25 kilowatt hours per square meter per annum, which is what Niddrie Road would be. And the paler green is something called the ACB retrofit standard, which is a bit easier to manage, but probably okay for most buildings. And this is relevant for heritage people, for conservation people, because as you all know, we can't always make this work perfectly in older buildings. And so a slightly easier target might be more appropriate. And it's worth saying that the ACB has a slightly broader range of issues it wants you to do with moisture and heritage and maintenance and so on. So in many ways, for me, I think it's probably, particularly for conservation people, it's maybe a more interesting target to reach. That's it in a nutshell. And it's just worth saying that we've started our first ACB retrofit. This is for Gilbert Housing Association on Westmoreland Street, corner of Westmoreland Street and what's it called, the street? I can't remember. We wouldn't have been able to make this in EnerPHit even if they'd asked us to, because to achieve that, we would have had to put so much internal insulation in that there would have been a huge risk to moisture damage. And so the fact that we're going for ACB is actually just as well, because we can't get EnerPHit anyway. Where's my thing gone? I keep losing it. Sorry. There we are. Okay, so that was just an introduction. So why we're interested in EnerPHit and Passive House, because we get what we said we're going to get, and because the numbers are low enough to be consistent with a sustainable future. And that's what we should, in theory, we should all be doing that. So this is the case study. If I've left enough time, I'm sure I have. The word that was used for about 6 months continuously in all the meetings at the beginning of this was that it should be replicable, but it isn't replicable because it sort of can't be in some ways, because it was all owned by one organization and it was void. And everybody listening to this knows fine well you don't always get empty tenements in one ownership. So it just isn't replicable in a sort of ownership way, but it's interesting in lots of other ways. So and there's not much we can do. One of the idiosyncrasies of EnerPHit is that because ownership patterns in Germany are quite different, they will only give you certification for a whole block. So you can't get an EnerPHit certification for your flat. And I raised this with them and said, look, I think you're going to limit your sort of, I don't know what the word is, market penetration or something. But they just do it their way. So that's fine. But the point is that when we discovered that we could get all of the flats in one go, that was the point at which we said, you could go for EnerPHit here. This could be a case study. It could be brilliant. Anyway, so they are all owned by Southside Housing Association and they're all void. The original idea was just to do a standard retrofit. I keep losing my thing. And that was going to be the plan for a while. But then we got extra funding from the Scottish Funding Council to demonstrate an exemplar project. And once we had the money to demonstrate an exemplar project, we had to have an exemplar project to demonstrate. So it rapidly got upgraded to an EnerPHit project. And there we are. So this is it in context. I hope that's obvious. Most of you will know I'm not a Glasgow person, so I find this sort of thing useful. But it's just next to the station there, and Queen's Park is just out of view on the south there. This is it looking sort of directly down. It's worth mentioning that it's heavily overshadowed, this block. So this block has buildings to all of its direct south, southwest and southeast, which is incredibly unhelpful because Passive House is very much about solar gain. You're trying to basically, in Passive House, you're trying to get about 1/3 of all your energy offset by the sun. And we can't do it in this, we can't get it in this building. We've got very small south-facing windows, southeast-facing windows. They're blocked by the buildings and they are further blocked by the trees, although we have removed a couple of trees. So we just don't get enough solar gain in this, which means we had to overspec the insulation. By contrast, we have gloriously large north-facing windows, which of course, all they ever do is lose heat. So that doesn't help. And we have, as you do in all retrofits, you have significant unavoidable thermal bridging. So the one thing that is worth saying is that one of the things that we forget when we're talking about costs is that this was more expensive than it would need to be because we had to do more stuff to get it to the right number. And I wouldn't necessarily do that in a normal building, normal retrofit. This is just to give you a feel for it. So it was a complete overhaul internally. It was in pretty bad nick. And over the winter before we started, some of the windows were broken and opened up, and it meant that everything got damp. So a lot of ceilings fell in and a lot of plaster fell in, which arguably shouldn't have been let happen, but that put a lot more cost onto the project and time, which didn't help at all. So a lot of the, so some of the stripping out was intentional, but quite a lot of stripping out wasn't intentional at all, and it happened anyway. Sorry, this is frustrating me. I can't navigate properly. Right, so where am I? So yes, there was quite a lot of long-term maintenance issues, quite a lot of timber repair. I mean, 20 grand's worth of repairing timber. We went for the EnerPHit energy performance in the end, but one of the things that we were very keen to push as well is issues about air quality and natural materials and healthy buildings, and a much more holistic approach to the fabric. So that pops up time and time again. People don't tend to talk about that stuff because everybody's about the EnerPHit, but we were actually trying to produce a much more holistic project, really. There were quite a lot of structural issues. There were bits of stone that rested on absolutely nothing at all. And all of those had to be sorted out. The other thing that's worth mentioning, and it was important to me, and it was quite hard work at the beginning, was there was an existing report by the contractors to spray the whole thing with about, I can't remember what it was, about 20 grand's worth of chemicals to guarantee that they wouldn't decay. And I can't bear those things, absolutely can't bear them. And so we got the guy that's needlessly pointing up at the ceiling there on the left to come and give a, what's it called, pathology, building pathology, to write a report which demonstrated that we don't need to do any of those chemicals. And so we worked together with him to show that that just simply wouldn't be necessary. So yes, where the timber is rotten, we replace it, but, excuse me, but yes, we didn't need to use any chemicals, and that did actually free up quite a bit of money at the beginning of the project. So it's just worth mentioning. That's the sort of nutshell picture of the whole building. I hope you can see it all, I hope you can read it clearly enough. It's a lot of it's fairly obvious stuff. We insulated the roof a lot. That's number one. Number two is that we made sure, so one of the unusual bits is that we sort of stripped off the bottom of the roof. We do that quite a lot on retrofits so that we can firstly make sure that the insulation meets, because it's quite difficult to get that loft insulation to meet the wall insulation. Anybody who's tried stuffing insulation into the corner of a loft will appreciate that it's not a simple thing to do. So we strip it all off so that it's easy to do, but it also enables us to check all the wall heads, all the rafter joists, the joins, all the gutters, make sure all of that stuff's neat and tidy. And so so that was done, and that was quite a bit of work. You'll see some photos. The external wall insulation on the back that you can see, and what you can just about see by that number 3 is that there were separate windows at the back, very small windows. So we took that mullion out at the back and made it into a bigger window because we were desperately trying to get more light in those southern windows. It doesn't seem like a big deal, but it made a huge difference to the ability to meet EnerPHit. It's obviously triple glazing, there's the EWIMs, there's MVHR, so there's mechanical ventilation, and there's also wastewater heat recovery. So we're recovering all the heat from the air, which is one of the main tactics that gets us down to the low levels. But we're also recovering wastewater heat from the water because the heating bills in those flats will not really be to do with keeping the flat warm, they'll be to do with heating water. So or that the bigger part of them will be to do with heating water. So we wanted to introduce heat recovery. The north side, we obviously didn't want to spoil the street side, so we internally insulated, but there are a lot of issues with internal insulation to do with, particularly with moisture and damage to the fabric of the building. And this is where my interest in conservation sort of spans sort of sciencey stuff, but also, you know, the sort of academic conservation, where internally insulating is going to happen a lot, and it carries a lot of risks for the fabric of the building, and so it's an important part of the story. We did quite a lot of stone repair and maintenance. We had to take the floor joists out, and I'll tell you a bit about that. We reorganized all the internals as well, and we obviously insulated the floor, and I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute. This tends to get glossed over, so I always put this slide in just to say that we did actually do quite a bit of work on the masonry externally, sorry, on the street side. You can't really tell when you take the scaffolding off and look at it, it's pretty similar apart from the daft orange mullions. But we did, so the mullions had to come off at the stairwell. I can't remember why, but all the other mullions stayed in place, but we just took them off and put them back again. Something in the way the windows were fixed, I can't remember now. So we'd off cleaned it. We repointed the whole thing in lime at the front anyway. There's quite a bit of stone replacement. You can see in that central picture there, there's a new sill. Quite a bit of Lithomex repairs, which you can see on the right there. And a fair bit of Kime painting, but Kime painting seems to, I mean, the color, that orange color that's on the mullions, that was carefully chosen by the Kime color person who comes in their van and checks it all. So I don't know why it went so wrong, but anyway. So there was quite a bit of that. I just wanted to mention that there are 5 aspects to Passive House, which you probably all know. Lots of insulation, no thermal bridging, air tightness, triple glazing, and MVHR. That's the kind of standard list. There's 2 of them. The triple glazing on the left, those are the details, and the point of the detail is to show you that what we're taking quite a lot of care over is air sealing and insulating the frames of the windows. So the weak spot in windows is the frame. So we make sure that those frames are covered as far as we possibly can with insulation. And then another thing that was for me an innovation, and I was really keen on, was this idea that we don't use plastic membranes everywhere to create the air tightness. We lime plastered it. So the air tightness layer in this building is lime plaster everywhere, well, on the walls. And that to me feels like a conservation approach to something which is about carbon efficiency, and I liked it. Although it was a bit of a pain because some of the areas of stone were really rotten, so they all came away. So we had to sort of build up the walls, which annoyed the contractor, but only in a couple of places, otherwise it was okay. So what you can see on the left is the internal insulation on the street side. That's so after the lime plaster went on to the stone, directly onto the stone, we got the wood fiber boards there, which you can see, and then various options of finishes internally. And externally, you can see there's 200 millimeters, which is a ridiculous level of mineral wool. But again, we had to compensate for this poor solar gain and the high losses to the north. So 200 mil of EWI on the south side. Right, the detail is broadly speaking the same as the detail on the right that you can see. For those of you who've got that sustainable renovation guide, it's more or less that drawing on the right. So that should give you an indication of what we did in detail. Where am I? This is the roof insulation. It's a sort of work in progress one. I was rushing to find the finished one, but I haven't got it. But essentially, it's an enormous depth of insulation in the roof and the floors, which can be a problem because you're having to sort of wade around in miles of rock wool, which is a pain in the neck. So we had to sort of devise a sort of process for insulating so people could still get at things. They'd managed to bury all the cables, so there was a big stushy about that. So they had to all be lifted out again. And that's the photo from the point at which we gave them a hard time about moving the cables out of the insulation. And you can see the floor insulation on the right there. So lots of insulation generally, but that's not particularly complicated. The complicated bit is the thermal bridges. So if you look at, so this is a sort of generic diagram of what happens when you insulate, is that basically you insulate the easy bits, and then you leave the difficult bits because it's impossible to get, all of those arrows are difficult bits to insulate or more expensive or something. So they tend to get left, and the thing with EnerPHit and Passive House is you can't leave them. That's responsible for a huge amount of heat, but it's also responsible for a mold risk, because if you insulate most bits and then leave some bits cold, those bits will be the bits that you get mold and condensation on. So from a health and air quality point of view, as well as an energy efficiency point of view, you really have to close those things off. So that little pink circle tells you where I'm heading next. So that is the base of the wall at the back. What I've shown there is, in inverted commas, a normal insulation for retrofit. So you insulate the floor joists, fair enough, and you put your external wall insulation on the outside. That there is a standard retrofit detail, more or less. And we do a lot of standard retrofit, or we improve it, but we've done a lot of standard retrofit. And I also do a lot of consultancy for other architects on their standard retrofit, saying, don't do this, basically. But this is what we've done. So if you see there, what I'm demonstrating is that those red lines are where you'll have heat loss. But you'll have heat loss, but the more important thing is that you'll have a cold surface internally. So you'll get basically black skirting boards and damp and mold on the inside. So there were several reasons why we need to avoid that, unless you've got extraordinary ventilation levels. So this instead is what we've done. So what you can see is that on the outside, we've taken the insulation right down to the ground, but you can probably still imagine that we could get heat going from the, I can't point to it, it's frustrating, from the inside of the building round and back into the solum. So what we've had to do as well is to take the insulation in the floor down the inside of the wall. I hope that makes sense. And there's quite a sort of science to that. So if you look on the right, that's the therm calculation for this. So it's very, very small, but hopefully just to the left of the top image, you can see a thing which says delta centigrade temperature, surface temperature is 14.93. Hopefully you can see that. So that's the temperature at the inside face of the skirting board there. And what we did was take that insulation down in the model until we got to a number around about 14, 15 degrees, because that's the surface temperature at which you won't get mold, you won't get condensation, assuming everything else is the same. If you've got 20 degrees internally and 60% humidity and all the rest of it. So we know that we won't get mold and condensation on the inside of the building because we've sorted out the thermal bridge, basically. Hopefully that you followed that. Another example is at the roof, because one of the weird things about this building, which made it far more complicated than normal, is that the roof, this isn't structurally true, but the roof sort of doesn't meet the wall. But it's certainly in terms of insulation, the roof doesn't really meet the wall. It tends to hit this sort of Bessemer beam which runs across, and then there's a sort of manky little sort of flat bit that runs along the front and the back. So it means that we have this big gap again. So we have in this case, the internal insulation coming up the wall, just you can see in the pink circle there. And then we've got the loft insulation all lovely on the top left, but they're not meeting. So, and again, normally you would just leave that because it doesn't say anything about that in SAP or in RDSAP. But we had to do this huge sort of faff with a sort of lead, I don't know, I can't remember the words, but basically we've got to bridge that gap in insulation terms, but also in weatherproofing terms. And that was one of the details I was most worried about, but they did a brilliant job actually on it. So internally, this is what you then see. So this is at the corner of the building with the gables. So that's why the wall insulation internally runs around the corner to overlap with the external insulation. And then we've got this stupid PIR board that we had to use that sticks down into the bay window, which I don't like, but we really didn't have much choice in that case. So that's the internal implications of that. And externally, we had to faff about with lead work and all the rest of it. It's just worth mentioning that one of the little battles that I won was that as a disciple of John Gilbert himself, you'll all have seen pictures of gutters leaking onto the top of the stonework and so on and so forth. So one of the things that I've tried to do is we always put a lead soaker underneath the gutter. So that's the lead soaker going in the gutter yet to be installed. But again, and also we've oversized the gutter. So quite a lot of the work we're doing in the office is about adapting to climate change. So saying to people that the change is coming and it's going to be very costly for people who own buildings. So if we can start to adapt our buildings to manage that, basically it's a small amount of money now and it will save you an awful lot later. So we've used those soakers that will protect the stonework, and we have oversized the gutters at, which was something actually that planning were not keen on because it changed the way it looked, but from a climate change point of view, it will make a big difference. So basically it's going to rain much harder, much heavier in much shorter bursts, and the gutters of Scotland will not be able to cope, and everything's going to overflow and it's going to backfill and all the rest of it up into the stone or the roof. So we've got to find ways of managing that. So hopefully this will work. On the back, it was the same story. The roof didn't really meet the wall in the same way in terms of insulation. So we had to build this sort of daft little thing that bridged the gap between them. Where is it again? Lost it. So that's that's sort of thermal bridging. There's another little bit, sorry for the science and the graphs, but I hope this makes sense. One of the issues with internal insulation is that it means that the outside of the insulation, i.e. the wall, then becomes permanently cold or relatively permanently cold. And that's not what stone walls were designed to be. They were designed to be sort of warm on the inside, cold on the outside with air movement generally. So if you start adding lots of insulation, you create a problem potentially, which we need to fix. If you leave a gap on the inside of the stone wall, which is quite common, you then have a thing called thermal bypass. So all the cold air gets in, usually, and then works its way around the whole building, and you can never find it. So what we've done in this case is we've lime plastered straight onto the stone. That means we can guarantee that there's no thermal bypass, there's no cold air moving around. And then we've had to use a wood fiber board. That's partly for ecological reasons, but it's partly for moisture. In fact, it's entirely for moisture, really. But we still have a risk. So just to explain these graphs, on the bottom left, you can see a graph with the sort of wiggly green lines that hopefully you can see stays well below the 80% humidity stroke moisture content in the stone wall. So that's the back wall, that's the EWI wall. So we know for certain that over 10, 15, 20 years, that wall is not going to get, the moisture content in that wall is not going to increase to a level where it could be a problem for any of the timber that's in the wall, because it's being kept basically warm and dry by the external insulation, assuming that's 100% okay. On the north facing side, it's a different story, because what you can see is that as soon as you start putting heating into that building, but you've kept the heat away from the stone wall, the relative humidity, the relative moisture content in that wall then goes up. And you can see 6 options there, which the WFI people have calculated, and all of them more or less hit that 80. In fact, they were trying to be nice, they put it at 85 just to be helpful, but it doesn't really change the fact that it's not very good. And I took the mickey out of them for doing that, and they said, oh, we didn't think you'd notice that, but it's meant to be 80. Anyway, the point is they're all over the 80 mark, which means that that wall will be more or less permanently, arguably, too damp. It won't affect the stone necessarily, although I'm interested to know what the long-term effects of having a permanently cold, damp stone wall are on things like mortar and salts and all that sort of thing. But from the point of view of any timber that's in the wall, it's a disaster. So we can't guarantee that it will be a problem, but I think it's safe to be cautious. Anyway, so the point is we decided off the back of that that we wouldn't, so we'd take the timber out of the wall. So that is the detail. So on the left, what you can see is instead of the timber joists running into the wall, which hopefully you can follow, it's difficult because I know that I've seen these drawings so often I forget, but the bottom left drawing shows that instead of a joist going all the way into the wall, which you can just see in a dashed line, it stops and we run the lime plaster across the stonework, and that gives us a complete airtightness line. We then put a foam glass, or yeah, it was foam glass in the end, sort of blocking piece, and then we bolt a perimeter beam, a ledge beam to it, and then we run all of our joists into that. So there is no timber in the wall, which is just as well, because we think that if it was in the wall, it would decay. And that's one of the big things that I think is going to be an issue in older buildings in the future, because we are all busy, in order to conserve the external stone frontages, we're all putting internal insulation in. And that internal insulation is going to create problems in the walls. And where you have timber or other organic material in that stone wall, I think there's a long-term problem being created here. So it was more expensive, but we argued the case for the client, and they accepted. So hopefully that makes sense. That's the lime plaster gone across, and then the blocking pieces, and then a bit of a mess after the windows went in. But basically that's, then you can see the ledge beam there. And the wood fiber insulation. So hopefully that makes sense. That's the MVHR that's in the ceiling. So we drop the ceilings in the bathroom and the hall, and that enables us to get everything in to the rest of the house, the rest of the flat. I'm just conscious of time. I think we're actually okay for time. Heating, stupid little radiator, but it's funny. So the heating system is, there's a long saga about the heating, but essentially what it boiled down to is that the 4 lower flats will have an air source heat pump, and the 4 upper flats will have new gas boilers. That there was it's a very complicated situation, but essentially we aren't allowed to put heat pumps on the walls, but there is a limit to how far you can run hot water from heat pumps. So the compromise situation was that we had, you can just, oh no, it's on the next slide, you can see the heat pumps at the back, which can only go up to the first floor, and then at the top we had an air source heat pump, we had gas boilers, sorry. And there was some interest in that as an idea, because the whole project is going to be monitored. So the monitoring team were quite keen on that. In other projects, we're not wanting to do that because it's arguably unfair on tenants that we're experimenting with them, if you know what I mean. But in this case, everybody knows it's an experiment to an extent, and it enables us to monitor and then check if there's any differences in practical and energy efficiency terms in the long term between the gas boilers and the heat pumps. So that's that. There's some photos. Oh gosh, this navigation thing's driving me mad. I'm sorry. That's the back wall. Now, I mean, initially the planners were dead against EWI on the back wall, and I have every sympathy for that. I would far rather have seen the stone personally myself, but it's trying to get an overview of how do we make, how do we address climate change? And I think for me, it's a reasonable compromise to say that the front is kept, well, repaired and conserved and kept the way it is. So the streetscape is the same, but we lose the back. Now, I don't think that's a black and white thing to say, but to me, that seems like a reasonable compromise. It means that, yes, we lose the stonework at the back, but the people are not paying £150 a month, they're paying £10 a month to keep warm. And because there is such an issue for me about inequality and how, fuel poverty and things like that, I think it's a fair deal, but I know different people have different views on that. The orange is, in my opinion, a mistake, but it was in fact carefully worked out by the client representative to copy the original paint, apparently, although I don't believe it. Hopefully it will soften up. There was a question on Twitter about the window colors. The original stair windows were black, but all the other windows are white, so we just copied that. And it's all timber windows. It's all Green Building Store Ultra windows. Anybody's interested? We are having an ongoing issue with the contractors at the moment because they're not there with the air tightness. We haven't got there with the air tightness, and that's a worry. It's a big worry for us. But one of the things that we talk about, I sit on various committees about retrofit and the future of Scottish, what we're going to do and so on. And there's lots of talk about training. Obviously, I do think there's training is needed. I think the training is needed for what you might call the white collar people, the people who make decisions. I think there's more training needed for clients, professionals, architects, planners, building control officers. I think those guys need training. The builders, maybe not so much. The issue with the builders is that it's a very difficult attitude. I personally think builders need as much training as they need just a sort of a culture change. I'm not kidding, there are hundreds of photographs like this of where basically the drawings haven't been followed, the care hasn't been taken, things are not as they should be, and it's been an enormous effort trying to keep on top of all the things which we've drawn and they've said they'll do and they haven't done, and so lots and lots of issues. So my feeling is not exactly that the construction industry needs a vast amount of training. I think there needs to be a culture change where people just take care. They have the drawings, they follow them, they take care, they go carefully, they make sure things are right. It's less of an issue in conservation jobs, I would say, I think, in my experience, but this is, for want of a better phrase, conventional contractors on a conventional project. Yeah, it's a culture thing more than a training thing, in my opinion. We have ongoing issues trying to make sure that we achieve the airtightness. And one of the problems is that what we had said in the contract documents is that the airtightness layer needs to be available at all times so that you can test it, and if there's ever a problem you can deal with it. But what's happened is that in order to enable finishing off the top flats first, the contractors have covered up the airtightness layer, and now we're not getting the numbers that we need. And it's harsh to say, but that, then they're going to have to pull stuff off to try and find it, and they can't find it at the moment. So hopefully we'll get there, but at the moment it's becoming a problem. So we've had to do a lot of testing, a lot of airtightness testing, smoke testing, thermographic, auditory, all sorts of stuff. We've been on that site a lot. Just a quick note about monitoring and engagement with the tenants. So there's been quite a lot of engagement with tenants. Anybody who's done research knows that how people operate in the building is arguably even more important than what's stuck to the building in terms of insulation. So we're doing quite a lot in terms of quick start guides and tenant engagement, but there's also a whole monitoring process, so that will reveal the truth, which I hope is going to be okay. EnerPHit approach will deliver real energy savings, assuming that we make the airtightness. We will, in theory, at any rate, have definitely made it about 90% more efficient. What exactly happens in terms of the people and how they use the building is another matter, but we want to work hard with them to make sure they understand the implications. And so theoretically, we'll get a good result from the people as well as the building. From a heritage point of view, I would say most of the public-facing important heritage was conserved and reasonably well looked after, not so much at the gable and the rear, although I suppose technically that work is reversible. But it's worth saying there are two things that are on my mind a lot when it comes to conservation and climate change. One is that climate change is going to threaten old buildings much more. So if you are interested in conservation, the buildings that you care about are more under threat than, for want of a better phrase, all the other buildings. And that's partly because of the location, because they tend to be in the older, lower lying areas near the river, near the sea, and so on and so forth. But also because of their construction, because they tend to be monolithic in their construction, they're far more susceptible to the sort of things that climate change is going to do to buildings, which we talk a lot of with clients. So there's more, if anything, reason to be concerned. But the other issue that is preying on my mind at the moment is that I think we need to look at conserving the whole physical reality of traditional buildings, not just what they look like. And my concern about some of what passes for conservation or heritage issues are that we're concentrating on what buildings look like, but we're not concentrating on actually conserving the real physical bit of building that we're talking about, because a lot of things that are happening, particularly with energy efficiency, are going to damage or have the potential, the risk of damaging buildings, and that's not good. But it's all manageable. It's all manageable if we have a sort of balanced and balanced approach to things. The other thing is, you know, we need to conserve buildings, but we also need to address climate change. We also need to address inequality, fuel poverty. You know, we work on social housing, and the conditions that people are living in are awful, and it's not fair. It's just not fair. So we are really pushing to try and make that better. And we need to do so without creating negative consequences like mold and condensation. So there are a lot of things going on all at once that we need to manage. A little bit on cost. I think I'm kind of at my end of my talk, so I've got a couple of slides, that's all. Broadly speaking, Passive House or EnerPHit is probably somewhere between 0 and 10% additional costs compared to a normal-ish piece of work. It rather depends on what you're planning to do anyway. And that does reduce with experience and scale. Some of our projects haven't actually been that much more expensive than others, but it does depend. Some have been much more. The issue I've got with cost is that the benefits are multi-sector. So the benefits are carbon emissions, the benefits are fuel poverty, their health, their heritage. There's lots of benefits which we bring when we do these sort of high quality projects, if you like. But you tend to find that the costs have been met by one pot, but the benefits are accruing to lots of pots. And I get very frustrated. It'd be really nice if that could be recognized somehow financially, but everybody knows that there's a sort of silo mentality in the way the costs are managed. It wouldn't seem as expensive if the costs were being met by the sectors that were benefiting, is what I mean, I suppose. And there are also lots of sort of benefits, costs of emissions avoided, and so on and so forth. There will be quite heavy costs associated with each two for those of you who are working in social housing, and they won't deliver the savings that you've then paid the money out for. So for me, it's about, well, yes, let's use money, but then let's make sure we're using it wisely. And there has been a cost benefit analysis done by a number of academics on Niddrie Road. And what was interesting was that the answers vary to an extent, depending on whose money you're talking about. So if it's Scottish government money via Glasgow City Council or direct, that's one thing, but the savings are accruing to people who arguably benefit most from those savings. So when you factor that in, it changes the nature of the sort of the sum. And for me, as an environmentalist, the thing that really matters to me is that what's really expensive is not doing this for 50 years when we knew that we should, and now being sort of forced to do it quickly. And it's worth saying that, yes, it might be expensive now, but it's going to be a lot more expensive in 5 years and a lot more expensive in 10 years. So, you know, almost we should just get on with it. On the bottom right, it's worth mentioning that the BRE, the Building Research Establishment, looked at poor housing as and tried to factor in the cost to the NHS. And what you can see there at the bottom of that sort of grey table is that poor housing is comparable, but not quite the same, but nearly the same as well, certainly more than physical inactivity, and it's comparable with the problems or the cost to the NHS of smoking. So it's a huge issue. So from an energy efficiency, but also a sort of maintenance and care point of view, this is a really big deal. And again, it demonstrates that the costs are moving, are sort of swirling around, or the benefits are swirling around. We're doing quite a lot of other EnerPHit projects. Actually, one of those probably won't happen now, but most of them should. And that is it. I think I'm only 2 or 3 minutes late. I'm going to stop if I can work out what to do.
That's great. Thank you so much, Chris. And that was really interesting, and obviously a really, really important project, and one that raises questions, but also helps us show sort of ways forward in terms of dealing with these issues of energy efficiency and, as you say, climate change. So we do already have quite a few questions. So I will go ahead and get started on asking some of these. It looks like there's a couple of questions that seem to fall into certain categories. So I will start off. There was quite a few questions about the heat pumps. So I'll start off with those questions first, as a group. So the first question about heat pumps was why they can only go to the first floor.
Because because the manufacturer won't let you go too far before the efficiency drops off, because you're pumping the hot water too far. I have raised that with them on a couple of occasions. It does actually depend on what type of heat pump you use. I have subsequently found out that there are other types of heat pump. I think that is it the one that's using carbon as a, I can't remember. But the point is, for the system that we used and for the consultants that we were working with, or the manufacturers, that was as far as they could go before they said the efficiency would drop off and you wouldn't get the savings. And we do want to try and keep the efficiency.
Right. And then again, going along with heat pumps, were there any plans initially to install ground source heat pumps with pipes buried in the back garden area?
Yes, we talked about it, but there's no way of getting any sort of decent sized machinery in there because it's completely landlocked. So it would have had to have been through the close, and so basically no.
Right. Makes sense. And then let's see here, we've got a couple more about heat pumps. Someone was asking if they can go in the loft.
Yes, well, we looked into that. There are sort of combined units that we can do. We are hoping to do that in the next job, actually, put them in the roof, because well, just because we're trying to make it work. The next job, which is the ACB retrofit, we are hopefully going to put heat pumps in the roof in their own little sort of funky little dormer windows that we're going to build. That should work, but that's taken quite a lot of trouble. The manufacturer basically said no, absolutely no way. So we've had 2 technical meetings with the manufacturer, and I persuaded them that it is fundamentally reasonable. It's just not what they normally do. But I think that it fundamentally works. The key thing is you can't block their airflow. That's the thing. So as long as the dormers are built large enough and without blocking to the airflow, I think it will work. That's what we're planning to do at the moment. Famous last words. We'll see what happens.
We'll wait and see what happens then. Okay, so then I think that is all of the questions about heat pumps. Moving on to, there were a couple of questions about the windows. You can see some of the things that you mentioned and then said, oh, and then people are like, oh, do tell us more about that. So David was wondering, the mullions on the front elevation, are they that color due to the finish, or is it a composite insulated replacement?
No, it's just the same thing that was there all the time. It just got painted, and it got painted, in my personal opinion, the wrong color. But it was apparently based on a chemical analysis of the paint that was there. They were already painted. So they're a mix of stone and concrete that has been painted to match the stone. And the kind people came and took away a sample and came back with a mix that matched it. And I just doesn't match as far as I'm concerned, but whatever, you know. But no, they're the existing, I think they're all stone apart from a couple that are concrete, but they were original. We just put them back again. We haven't changed anything.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, as you said, maybe obviously it'll potentially become a little bit less
so.
right orange, because I noticed, as you mentioned on when we posted about this on Twitter, that was the question that came up a couple of times, people just wondering if that was
but by the time you've got them painted and you've turned up 3 weeks later and the guys have left, you're like, are we going to get them back to repaint that?
Yeah.
That's right.
And then just one more about the windows. To comply with the conservation area, can wooden framed windows be used?
Yeah, they were wood. They were wooden frame.
Okie doke. So then in terms of, we've got another question here. Eric is saying, great presentation, Chris. Yep, definitely great presentation. Please, would you explain a little bit more about how the building pathology report helped avoid the use of chemical treatment of timber? What was involved? Was it about how best to use the design improvements to manage building fabric moisture effectively, etc.?
Right, so I said, we don't need to do that. And the client said, look, you're just an architect. And I said, yes, but I've been to lots of courses about this. I know quite a lot about it anyway, but they weren't buying it. And so I thought the way around this is to get an expert. So we commissioned, what's his name? John Drury. Some of you will know John Drury. He used to be based up here, but apparently he's moved down to Wales now, but he comes up to Scotland quite a lot anyway. There's quite a lot of people. The Lime Centre recommended him in this case, and he was happy to do it. So we got him to come and basically write a report that said the same thing I said. But this time it came with a report that looked sort of proper, and and also we were essentially saving the client 20 grand. So the problem was that the contractor and the company doing the chemical treatments were sort of tied into each other, so they were trying to block it, but well, basically we won. And so how does it work? We don't need to treat the timber because we're essentially maintaining the construction in a state in which further decay or insect attack wouldn't take place anyway. So I mean, I think most of you probably know this stuff, you know, I mean, insect attack and decay only takes place under certain conditions. So if you just don't have those conditions, you don't need to spray it full of stuff. So we just need to make sure that those conditions are maintained. And if anything, MVHR tends to dry buildings out a bit too much. I mean, so we have to watch the flow. So we're quite knowledgeable at MVHR, but if you do straightforward normal MVHR, you will tend to find that your relative humidities in the building are too low. So we tend to lower the volume flows, and then it's not so bad. But essentially, the building will be, if anything, slightly drier than it should be, rather than too damp. So we just won't get a situation where you would get decay or insect attack, and therefore we don't need to spray them.
Right.
And those sprays are incredibly bad for people. I mean, especially children and pregnant women and things like that. It's not good.
Absolutely. So there's a question, how much were room sizes reduced by, and did they have to be reassessed or downgraded from double to single bedroom? And could this affect rental income?
No, the bedrooms stayed the same, apart from having to put a cupboard in for the, that cupboard was the same. The cupboards for the heat pumps had to be enlarged, but the bedrooms basically stayed the same. The bit that changed was there was like a daffy kitchen at the back, and that's all been knocked together to make one bathroom. So they're one bedroom, and the one bedroom basically stayed the same. The bathrooms have got significantly nicer because the bathrooms were sort of entertainingly stupid shapes. You couldn't, I mean, if you were slightly overweight, you wouldn't, you couldn't reach the loo. You had to walk sideways down this. And then the kitchen's been moved into a sort of bigger knocked through front room. So the north facing rooms are sitting room come dining come kitchen, which is what the client wanted. And then the bedrooms are at the back, and the bathrooms are now much, much, much nicer. Perfect. So I think it improves. I think it will. Well, certainly that. I mean, that was something that we let the client dictate what they wanted.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, if it's a housing association, there might be slightly less considerations when it comes to rental income and things like that. It's different than if it was private landlords, I'm assuming.
Yes.
It's more uniform. Then, okay, so now moving on to, there's a couple of questions about the internal wall installation. So Gillian was wondering, in your opinion, should every IWI element be modeled in WIFI and other WIFI results always reliable predictors of moisture risk?
You don't need to do it if you know for certain that it's going to work. Are they reliable? No. I did the WIFI course years ago, about 10-15 years ago. They did a WIFI course in Glasgow, so I went on that. Oh, it's mind-numbingly dull. Oh my god, I don't really enjoy that sort of thing, but I did go through it and I got the certificate. But so I understand it. I just don't remember how to do it all the time because it's dull. But the thing I came away with, which may or may not be true, and it certainly wouldn't be agreed with by people who sell WIFI, is that when you've got a solid bunch of stuff all stuck together, so if you've got a sort of rendered wall with a plastered internal surface and all of these, and then you've got your wood fibre and so it's pretty good at predicting what will happen into the future when you've got a contiguous construction, that's the phrase. I think it gets a little bit muddled when you introduce air gaps. That's my own view, because some of the things that happened when we modeled it in the course suggested that when it seemed to be counterintuitive. But we use WFI quite a lot, and it's mostly good. It's like Passive House, it's mostly good. It's just not perfect, you know, nothing's perfect. So, and it's how you apply it. But yeah, I think WFI is useful. The main reason I think it's useful is because the sort of things that it highlights are the sort of things that a lot of people don't talk about or think about, and therefore just by doing it, you're sort of raising the issue. Basically, everybody's obsessed with carbon and nobody's talking about moisture and heritage, or listing in my circles. And so by raising the issue, you make people talk about it. I don't think it's 100% accurate in my opinion. And it's particularly not accurate when you have moving air. So you get into this whole thing of, is it better to have a lath and plaster with a gap or not, and so on and so forth, you know. But there are other issues to bear in mind. So we closed it off because of thermal bypass, which is a passive house and energy efficiency thing, but then felt we needed to go back and look at WFI. I hope that's a decent answer. I don't know if it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think, oh, sorry, somebody was just struggling with acronyms. What is WFI? It is, sorry, can you tell? I can never remember what it stands for.
No, it's German and I couldn't possibly do it, but it's basically, it's hygrothermal modeling. So it's dynamic modeling. You know how you get a Glazier method condensation risk? That says, you know, you're going to get condensation in the outside of your render, so you better use lime or something like that. But it's a steady state thing. It just takes a moment in time and goes, if you do all of these things based on their vapor permeability and the differential temperature, you'll get condensation or not. And oh, thank you, somebody, I've just seen it now.
Yeah, it's a German term. So yeah,
but what WFI does is it does a dynamic thing. So it says it does it dynamically, and it sort of says, you know, day will follow night, will follow day. Heating and moisture will change over time internally. In the evenings, it will be higher, and so on and so forth. And then it does it over years and years and years, because what matters is not necessarily exactly what happens in a steady state, but what happens in 10 years time, long after people like me have gone and, you know, think we've got away with it. So it's trying to forecast what will happen in reality. So it's obviously far more useful.
Perfect. And then just one more question about insulation. Mark was asking, what was carried out to the inside close walls in terms of insulation? Same,
it was the same. So with EnerPHit, with Passive House and EnerPHit, that the whole block has to be taken as one. So the basically the close is the same as the flats. But what that also means is that instead of having, because if you, and that's one of the reasons it's very different from SAP or RDSAP, because in SAP it would just be the flats, you know. But it means that you only have to have, because the doors in Passive House are quite expensive, especially when you've got level access and security and so on and so forth. So we only had to have 2 expensive doors, one at the front of the close and one at the back, and we didn't have to have 8 expensive doors linking the flat to the close. So it's the best solution anyway.
Alrighty, and then just looking at the some of the studies that you mentioned, are you able to pass on the details of the comparable measured case studies being carried out? Will those be published at some point?
What comparable case? I don't know.
I think those were some of the case studies that you mentioned at the end of further projects.
Oh, the other ones. Oh yeah, they're just they're just in the office at the moment. Two of them are being built at the moment. So yeah, I mean, you know, they'll be on the website or something. Well, they're not at the moment, actually.
And then just going along with, we kind of touched on this already, but someone was wondering what was the cost per flat of the project? So obviously, because it was done by a housing association, I'm assuming that wouldn't have been as much of a factor.
Yeah, so the cost thing, I mean, the cost changed because so when before it got too bad, so when we first set out, it was going to be about 80 grand a flat, basically. 86,000 pounds a flat. But of that, 32 was the energy efficiency stuff. So but basically 32,000 was for making it more energy efficient, and then about 55 or something was for the flat share of a complete rewiring, redoing the roof, redoing the gutters, taking all the timber joists, redoing the bathrooms and all of that. You know, everything was stripped out. So there was about 55 grand in sorting out the building in a maintenance way, and about 30 grand in making it energy efficient. But that 30 grand, or 32, I think it was 33, I remember, that really didn't change, because we didn't change the energy efficiency stuff. By the time we went to site, we knew what passed EnerPHit. We didn't have to mix. What we did have to do is quite a lot of other things happened, which made it even more expensive. So all the ceilings fell off for a start, which was entertaining. And then a lot of the lath and plaster came away, because they'd let it get damp, you know, so it all got really damp, and so nobody wanted to plaster onto existing damp plaster and stuff. So that 55 of other stuff, in inverted commas, went up, so that it was over 100 grand by the end, but which is bonkers, really. But there were a huge amount of changes that the client wanted. So I'm from the outset, we kept the cost separate. So there were 3 columns in all of the cost information. There's 3 separate columns, which are, if you like, client side things, sort of long-term maintenance things, and then energy efficiency things. So we know that they're costs. So we know what those costs are. I hope that helps.
And then kind of going along with that, Sam was wondering what advice you would give a client undertaking a similar project for an occupied tenement. So obviously that's a whole different ballgame in terms of what can be done.
Yeah, no, I mean, so there's quite a lot of things. I mean, what we were doing, we were working with Renfrewshire Council on this. So we had a sort of strategy there. So what we were doing was that, you know, a significant amount, it's different because at Renfrewshire Council, we were working, well, and a couple of clients actually were working more with council tenement sort of properties. So we didn't have the conservation side of things. So we were doing about 85% of the work as a one-off contract to the outside of the building, including ventilation. And then, but that would be, it wouldn't be complete. It wouldn't be complete as a project. And then, but you could control almost all of it. And certainly in terms of cost, you can control almost all of it. And then whenever there's a void, whenever somebody moves or there's a change, you then go in and finish off the rest of it. But you can get pre-certification for that if you're interested. So you can agree in advance that that's what you're going to do with the Passive House Institute, and then get sort of certification in advance for, and then just when people move out or there's a change in flat or it becomes void for whatever reason, you go in, tidy it up and sort of tick the last box, as it were. So that's the way we developed it, because you can't go in and turf people out for that sort of thing all the time.
Absolutely. And then a question on what were the key challenges on site when replacing rotten joists and rafters?
No, that was fine. There was no problems really. It's just normal. Find rotten stuff, cut it out, support the floor while you're cutting it out, put stuff back. That went really quickly, actually. Well, I say that, I was there one time and we were talking about it, and when I came back, it was all done. But I don't think I mean, there were no specific, I mean, it's just about propping things while you're cutting them out, isn't it?
And then finally, we've just got this, looks like more of a comment, but someone just talking about their own project and, you know, some changes in building regulations. I mean, I guess, so as I said, Neil, if you do actually have a question, do you want to rephrase that as a question? I'm not quite sure what the question is in that comment there.
Thanks for that, and thanks for your presentation. I have enjoyed it. It's something I've been thinking about for a long time. As a former Glasgow fireman, I've been in more back courts than most people in Glasgow, and I know the limitation of access to these things. I've also ripped out tenements in the middle of the night after fires and lath and plaster and all of that. So I've been thinking about this particular point that you've addressed in your presentation. But I live on Arran, and I live in a 5-bedroom detached house, which I have renovated over 34 years at great expense, re-roofed, re-floored, re-plumbed, re-everything. And I've had a look at it. It would cost me at least £50,000 to convert to air heat source, because I would have to change all my central heating back to 15 mil from 10 mil. To replace the oil aga is 12,000 alone. I won't prolong the question. So my point is, your project was interesting. It was in common ownership during a void, but I really wonder, and building regs have never changed in a oneer before. They've always been phased in at new builds and major refurbs. it seems to me we're now being forced into something in the next couple of years that's never been done before. And there will frankly be people, and I'm one of them at 75, I'm not going to look at a £50,000 job. I'm just not going to do it. Now, the losers will be my daughters because this will be their inheritance. But I'm not going to rip this house to bits, A, because I don't want to, and B, because my wife wouldn't let me. So you will recognise the difference in between a tenement block in single ownership and individual house owners. How do you think that can be addressed?
Well, I mean, I do. One of the things that I do personally is for the practice is these sort of one-day consultancies. So there are actually quite a lot of people who do want to spend the money, who do want to address the problem, and so for those people, I tend to come out and do a day with them and just say, well, this doesn't make sense, but that does make sense. For God's sake, don't spend money on that because you'll never get it back. But make sure you do A, B, and C, and then do it in that order. And given that you've got a budget of X, then probably don't bother with that, and this sort of thing, because the difficulty most people have, I think, is that they sort of know lots of generic things like heat pumps are good, or maybe heat pumps are bad, or loft insulation is important, or maybe it's not. There's lots of sort of information out there, but it's sort of trying to make sense of it all and relate that to what your personal thing is, so I would say, I mean, in your case, I don't know. I mean, if you've just spent money on it and you don't want to spend any money on it, that's that. I'm not going to make you do it. But for those people who do want to, then it's sort of trying to get a strategy that makes sense, because there is also the age-old thing of there are plenty of people selling you stuff that doesn't help you at all, but it helps them. So it's the usual thing, I mean, double glazing salesman, it's a sort of thing, isn't it? Everybody knows what it's like. But no, there are plenty of people who are doing it, and it's a sort of, well, we offer a sort of, I suppose, what you call a bespoke solution to people to try and say, well, this is how you can prioritize what you need to do, given what you're trying to achieve.
Thanks for that. It's not that I'm not totally anti the whole concept. My problem is I'm 75.
Yeah.
And of limited income. And now, if you turned the clock back 34 years and I was starting this renovation, obviously you would go along with what was the thing at the time when you're ripping out rotten joists, etc., which I did. But to start doing it now as a whole project, it's just a non-starter. And there are many people in this district living in Victorian houses with solid walls at 28-inch, 750 mil thick. They're rubble walls. That's the way they are. There's a lot of people not going to want to undo their lifetime's work in getting their house into a habitable state.
Yeah, I know. I agree.
Yeah, I mean, clearly it's a case-by-case basis. So thanks, Niels. We've got a couple more questions here. I think these will be quite short, and then I think we will wrap up just because we are past 1:30 here, and I know everyone's, I'm sure, very busy and want to get started with their afternoon. So we have a question about you mentioned the properties hadn't quite met the numbers required for air tightness and investigation was required. Have the numbers been reached now, and are the houses tenanted?
Houses not tenanted yet. They should have been. The contractor is still trying to resolve the air tightness. No, we haven't met it. It's a big risk because as yet the contractor hasn't met the number that they need to meet. And if that is the case, it will not be certified as EnerPHit. There's no way around it. It will be hugely embarrassing for us and for the client. And we're all fairly sort of, I just have to accept, and the reason is that they've covered it up, so we can't find it. That's the problem. Well, they can't find it. So there's lots of, people trying to make sure that it's somebody else's fault going on at the moment. But I mean, I just hope that they do manage it. But the simple truth is they might not, in which case it won't be EnerPHit. It will still obviously be a pretty good thing, but they will effectively have breached their contract. So there'll be all sorts of other shenanigans to deal with then. I don't know what will happen, but there aren't tenants in because they're still trying to work out where the problem is.
Great. And then one last question, also about monitoring. Did you also monitor VOC levels prior to completion?
No, because it was void, so there wouldn't have been anything. Oh, you mean prior to completion? Well, there's monitoring now and they will be monitoring. Are they doing VOCs? I don't know if they're doing VOCs there. So I think they should be. Because I wrote a paper at the beginning to say these are the things these are the things that we're seeking to demonstrate, and therefore these are the things you might as well measure so that we can actually demonstrate them. I can't remember now. They're certainly measuring energy consumption and air quality and all the rest of it, but I don't know if it includes VOCs. I can't remember actually. Hopefully it will.
Great, perfect. Well, I think that is all of our questions. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in this project, and people are really interested, especially here in Glasgow. I mean, this is clearly retrofitting and updating tenements is something that is one of our biggest conservation challenges. So yeah, it's really interesting to hear about a project like this. So thank you so much, Chris, for your time. I know we have run a little bit over, gone a little bit further into your afternoon, but thank you so much for that. And thank you everyone for joining us. And as Sylvia mentioned, do keep an eye on our website for further GCHT events. We'll also be doing some more CPDs in the autumn. And other than that, yeah, just thank you all so much. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cheers.